Today, we become legends.
So I think enough has changed since my last top 3 gods for every role video to warrant an update to the list. I usually update these every few patches when major meta shifts happen to keep you all in the know on the best gods to use at the moment. So if you want to stay updated and fresh on the meta, then definitely subscribe to the channel to be notified of all my videos. Plus that helps us get to the 100k mark. We'd love to have you around in the Nay Nation. These lists are a combination of as many credible sources of research as I can find, as well as my own personal opinion thrown in there as well to get a really accurate look at what's good at the current moment. So let's just jump in with the solo laners. So the first one is a pick that has taken the solo lane, and elsewhere for that matter, by storm recently, that being Set. In recent weeks, Set has really emerged as a top solo laner, as well as a solid jungler, even seeing some mild play in mid and ADC as well. Something about this god is clearly overtuned, and I've been saying it for a while actually, and he's performing insanely well both in SPL and in ranked right now. His ability to run through fights is pretty much unparalleled from solo lane right now, and if you start to snowball with Set, it's pretty much GG. He is one of the more difficult gods to play, and so if you're not familiar with him, I would suggest learning him properly before taking him into ranked or trying some of the other solo laners I have on this list. But Set is exploding onto the scene right now as we speak, and I had to give him a spot in the solo lane section here. As I said though, he sees play elsewhere as well. Moving back to a familiar pick, Cthulhu for the second spot. This one doesn't really need too much explanation beyond his insane teamfight presence, CC, Thorns abuse, and solo lane laning phase to boot. I'm sure if you've been playing the game at all since his release, you know why Cthulhu is here. Despite taking a fair few nerfs, he's still among the best solo laners in the game, and if you need a magical solo laner in your god pool, I highly suggest Cthulhu be that guardian for you. And finally, King Arthur. A new but old face, the one true king has returned to the meta with force, using, or arguably abusing, the new Glad Shield to amp up his damage output to new heights, even for Arthur. There's not too much else to talk about with Arthur that's not already been said in the last couple of years, but he has a solid laning phase and some of the strongest mid-game rotations and teamfight presence of any solo laner, and honestly, his drop-off in the late game doesn't feel as bad anymore when he's hitting for 100 extra damage on all 8 of his abilities, so I definitely recommend trying Arthur out again with the new Glad Shield. And finally, before we move on, I can't not mention Amaterasu and Sun Wukong. These two were very dominant in solo for the last month or so, but have both fallen off slightly in favour of these new faces. That doesn't mean they're not still strong and worth playing though, so keep that in mind. Moving into the jungle, we have Nemesis first up. She's a returning face and a long-standing top pick in the meta since mid-season, so I won't spend too long explaining why she's strong. Nemesis brings that hyper-carry jungle potential to the table, while also being able to build into a more traditional ability-based playstyle and playing around her ult more if necessary. She's very flexible in that way, and she makes great use of the strong items right now like Serrated Edge, and remains a top 3 jungler as of right now. Next up is Tsukuyomi. Technically a new face since I didn't include him in my last video due to him being new, but Tsukuyomi, even after all of his nerfs, is still a very strong jungler. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. He's not the uncontested best god in the game like a lot of the whiners will tell you, but he's definitely worth having in your god pool for his insane damage numbers, plus his range that gives him an air of safety in fights, allowing him to poke from range while waiting for the perfect moment to all in. Similar to Nemesis, I probably don't need to spend too long telling you how Tsukuyomi is a strong jungle pick. So moving on, my final choice for jungle is Erlang Shen. This is a god that I've been saying is busted forever, but it seems I now have the data and SPL play to back up this placement. The only thing Erlang suffers with really is his lack of innate CC immunity and cripples, I guess. But other than those two things, he has crazy 1v1 potential, works amazing with all of the strong auto-attack jungler items right now, has solid lockdown and CC, and a lot of consistent damage output that means he never really tapers off in a fight like a lot of the ability-based junglers do sometimes once they blow their cooldowns. Not to mention he has some of the best objective damage and structure push of any jungler in the game. Erlang is definitely worth a top 3 mention in my eyes, and it seems the community finally agrees with me. And a quick honourable mention goes to the ever-present Thor. Since his rework, Thor has always been either top 3 or lingering just outside there, and that remains true today. He's still incredibly consistent and a tried and true all-rounder jungle pick for those that enjoy him. Moving into ADC, where the main change here comes in the form of the fall-off of magical ADCs. The last few months have been dominated by the likes of Freya and Olorun, and it seems the nerfs to both the gods and the items they use have finally taken their throne and returned it to the traditional hunters. They're still workable and definitely worth having in your god pool, but they no longer hold the top spots in my eyes. So our first ADC is probably expected for those who've been playing in the last month or so, that is Cupid. This lovable baby has stormed the meta recently as a top ADC. The buff to his Heart Bomb made his wave clear on par or even on the upper end of ADC wave clear, which allows him to really contest and trade with many gods that he previously couldn't in the laning phase, and it's rocketed him into a position where he sort of dominates the lane in most matchups, while also having insanely good teamfight presence as he always has with his ultimate, and no one is going to complain about an ADC being able to team heal upwards of 400 health in a pinch. Cupid is a very different pick to a lot of traditional ADCs, but he's definitely worth a spot on this list. Rama is next up, who's a similar story to Cupid actually, in that he spent a lot of time on the lower ends of viability, but through a few buffs it's brought him into the spotlight, both boosting his actual power level while also showing people that they were underrating him previously. Rama's hypercarry potential is some of the strongest you're going to see in the ADC role, and his laning phase is nothing to laugh at either, with his astral arrows giving him insane wave pressure at wave 1 and 2, often allowing you to out clear and hit level 2 before the enemy duo, which can lead to kills or just snowballing of the lane. He works decent with crit, but also excels with the popular Silver Ranch Kins pen builds that are floating around for ADCs right now, and is just a really strong pick. Definitely try out Rama if you haven't already. And finally we have Haim, who in my opinion is a step below these other two picks, but definitely still strong and worth considering for the role. What else do I need to say? It's Haim, the guy who ran the duo lane for a solid 3 months after his release, and despite nerfs is still really strong. He's incredibly safe due to his wall crystals and combat teleport, while also having some of the hardest hitting basic attacks in the game, and an incredible ultimate for setup and just raw damage, while taking a key target out of the fight for several seconds. Haim is still good, boys. Deal with it. And finally, honourable mention goes to Anhur, who hasn't seen the play yet, but after playing with and against his new jump, seems really scary to me as an aggressive lane bully type ADC. As I said, I don't have the data to back this one up yet, which is why it's just an honourable mention, but I have a good feeling about Anhur after the changes. Moving into supports, first up, the Kappa King has finally been recognised for his greatness. Kuzenbo has been steadily climbing the ladder since basically his release, and he's finally landed in top tier. His teamfight disruption is some of the most annoying stuff to deal with on the planet, and he can often keep enemies in one place for several seconds while his team pummels them into the ground. His access to thorns in his base kit makes him naturally great at dealing with ADCs and some of the basic attack junglers that frequent the meta nowadays, and he definitely deserves this spot. You've been through hell, my Kappa friend. Welcome to heaven. The next pick is Hercules, who's been a force to be reckoned with in support for a long time, and is my personal favourite pick to carry low-level ranked games, as he can basically just run around as a second jungler solo in camps, and perhaps the enemy mid laner if they aren't careful too. He bodies the early laning phase and can get your team tons of pressure and space early on to build their own leads while you get in people's faces. His teamfight, especially as Peel, can be a little bit lacking sometimes, but that's the trade-off you take, and his teamfight isn't terrible, just perhaps not quite as strong as the likes of Kuzenbo. Or Yamoja, who's my final pick. I really don't need to explain this one, do I? Yamoja has literally been a top support since her release without wavering once. Dominates lane, can use her cooldowns how she pleases, has insane teamfight presence, even has healing. There's not much Yamoja doesn't do, and to no one's surprise, she's still a top 3 support. The only negative to Yamoja really is that she can be tough to play at a top level, and if you're bad at her, you won't do well. But other than that, she's amazing. Put in the time to learn this god and you'll dominate from support. And for my support honourable mention, I have Sobek. He's one of my personal favourites, but also is seeing some solid SPL play as well, so I definitely still recommend him in the current meta. And finally, we have the mid laners. Mid is in a weird transitional spot where a lot of picks are rising as well as falling, and it's tough to define a clear top 3, or mostly a clear third spot since my top 2 are pretty well defined. The first of which is Persephone. She's really a mirror to Yamoja in a way, been a top 3 mid laner since her release, but is also very difficult to play well and thus requires a lot of practice to truly shine. But when you do learn her well, she's by far one of the strongest mid laners in the game, with her insane range, broken ultimate and relative safety, as she can sit way back behind her front line and still do her full damage potential from massive range. Pick number 2 is Hebo, another pick that has been top tier for a while now, and despite a couple of nerfs, I still think he remains top 2. He's basically hands down the best mid for straight up raw burst damage. If you want a specific enemy dead, you want a Hebo on your team. He's a bit risky and can get dived hard, but with some self-peel and the right team, he can be one of the most dominant mages for sure. And much like Hercules, is one of my personal top picks due to his easy carry potential for ranked. And finally, this third slot is where it gets murky because, like I mentioned before, there's a ton of mid laners that are rising into the top tiers and some that are falling out of top tier. So take this last pick with a grain of salt, as one of my honourable mention picks could easily sub into this spot. But my third slot here goes to Ra. I sort of use my own personal experience and judgment to fill this last spot, and I have personally been seeing Ra as a rising star in ranked and casuals lately. Plus, he's starting to see increased play in the SPL too. The buff to his 2 changed more than you'd think, and allows him to be picked as a great choice into many of the top meta gods that rely on slows to lock down enemy mid laners, such as Nemesis, Cupid, and Set to an extent. His healing is massively undervalued, and when used as a means to disengage and re-engage in a fight, it's one of the defining parts of Ra in late game teamfights. Then, of course, you still have the standard Ra Beam and Searing Pain pain, they hit incredibly hard and are both raw burst damage. If you can hit lines, I recommend trying Ra right now. And my honorable mentions here are Thoth and Aphrodite. Aphro is still strong but in the process of falling off in my opinion, and Thoth is a rising pick much like Ra that is seeing increased success lately with his massive range and burst damage. As I said, either of these two picks could probably take Ra's spot, and there are even other mid laners that are hovering on the edge of top 5. But to avoid listing 10 different picks in a top 3 gods for every role video, I'll leave it there. So that's the meta. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next update to this series when it drops, and to watch all my other videos too, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out you nerds.